Again, thank you very much for joining me on today's Composer webinar. My name is Kaylee Gonzalez. I am an elite applications expert for MLC CAD systems. I am actually based out of Phoenix, Arizona. Our webinar topic today is going to cover the creation and publication of advanced interactive content inside of SOLIDWORKS Composer. Now, before we jump actually into the software itself, I want to give you an idea of what the end result is that we're going to be working on. I want to give you an idea of where we are going throughout this webinar and what the end goal is. So what I'm pulling up on my screen, this is actually the SOLIDWORKS Composer player. I'll discuss what that is a little bit further on if it's something you're not familiar with. But what we are creating is some interactive content where we can dynamically move through our actual design and dig down deeper and deeper inside of the design itself in order to gather parts lists and to be able to see all this information, to possibly pan, zoom, and rotate to get a better idea of what we're actually working on and creating. This type of interactive content really is ideal for any type of assembly team or field services team where they need to reference something in 3D and be able to see what all these components are. This can also be ideal if you are planning on putting anything on a website. We can actually utilize these 4 parts lists and have people order off of them as well. I will be discussing exporting this information to SVG file types, it's vector graphics. We'll get to that towards the end of the presentation. But I did want to give you an idea of what the end result is going to be, so we have an idea of where we're going throughout the next several topics that we're going to be working with. In order to get to that final publication, I'm going to be covering 3 main topics with you today. First of all is going to be Composer View tips and tricks as far as exporting or publishing items as a vector graphics file and items that can help you set up and organize in preparation for creating interactive content. From there, we are going to actually create the content itself. We're going to create buttons, links, and talk about what that process looks like. And last, we're going to talk about publishing, how we can export this to a .smg file, utilize the Composer player, or utilize SVG files for web browsers. What I'm going to start out with inside of this webinar is an overview of the project that we are working in, as well as some view tips and tricks. As I go into SOLIDWORKS Composer, I want to give us a good idea of where we are starting from. I do already have a project that is started for us. I am assuming at this point that you understand how to create basic views. You know how to create this type of information and parts lists. This is all very fundamental portions of Composer that I'm assuming that you know, and I'm not going to cover those in any great depth. But what we can see inside of our views panel is we do have our initial view and we have an initial exploded view. Now this initial exploded view is going to serve as the base view for our interactive content. Everything that we create is going to be linked back into this base view. This is why I have separated it out into these 4 main sections. We also have all of our other views already created, such as our right side view, we have our left side view, and then our guard assembly, which is going to essentially be this particular subassembly already broken out. So we're utilizing views, some of the most fundamental portions of Composer, as the basis for all of this interactive content. So you do need to create your views first. This is how you're going to really organize a lot of your content, and then we create the links and the interactive content after that. So we also have our main body, motor, and our base assembly as well. A couple tips that I do encourage you to do if you are going to be creating links to other views or files or whatever the case is. First of all is to rename your views to something more meaningful. This is a very simple process. You can click on a view and hit the F2 key. That creates an active cell that you can change the name in. An alternative to that is to right-click on the view and rename it through that right-click context menu. We are going to see a couple of examples throughout this webinar where that becomes very beneficial. Another item that I do encourage you to utilize is something called camera views. If you do not use camera views a lot currently, or if you're not familiar with what they are, it is a great way to establish your camera orientation and zoom levels. Camera views do not actually capture anything specific to geometric or auxiliary actors. It's simply relating to the camera itself. But it creates a nice way that we can always snap back into existing views to stabilize our content and make it very consistent. Once you create a view, you can always utilize the camera icon up here in the upper left with the little coordinate system on it. That is how you can create a camera view. And you can see that it has a little camera in that bottom right-hand corner of the thumbnail. Again, I will be showing you a utilization of that as we go through and create some of this content. What I want to do next is all of our views are completed apart from one particular view, and that's this guard assembly. What we want to do inside of this type of view is we want to have some detail views established relating to some of this smaller hardware. We have some washers, we have some nuts, we also have an actual like screw that we want to have detailed views to as well. Now, these are very small in comparison to the overall design that we're working on, and so the details can often become lost. Looking at a washer as opposed to a nut can often look like the same thing, but we can create detailed views of that inside of Composer. Now, if you are familiar with Composer, you are going to know that we can absolutely use the digger tool to create 2D images. Now, the digger tool is a phenomenal tool. It does a lot of really great and wonderful things, but when it comes to detail views, there is actually a better way that we can create them. The digger tool will create 2D images, but those images are not vector graphics. We can create detail views that are vector graphics by going into our workshops and clicking on our technical illustration workshop. Inside of our technical illustration workshop, there is an item called detail view. And if I choose my detail view, notice how I get this magenta circle. This is going to allow me to zero in on a couple items, such as, in this case, this particular nut. We can change the size of this so that we don't capture any other information behind it, and simply hit create. This is going to create vector graphics. They're going to be very clear. If you're not familiar with exactly what vector graphics are going to do for you, what they are actually doing is when you zoom in or zoom out, they do not pixelate. So they do create very high quality images. And if our end goal is to actually export this to an SVG file, we want these to be as crisp and clean and vector graphics for that export process and that publishing process. I have one more piece of hardware I'm going to capture. I'm going to need this to be just slightly larger. Again, I'm trying to encompass a nice clean piece of hardware for this, and then click create. And I'm changing my attachment type so that it's simple as opposed to kind of that arc tool. Once we're done, we can go ahead and hit the exit, and I can zoom out a little bit. Now, all of these views, they are simply right on top of each other. We can start moving them around and resizing them so that it makes a little bit more sense. Same thing with the washer in this case. So as you can see, when I make them larger or smaller, they are not losing their clarity. The tip to utilizing this is you do want to zoom in pretty close when you are making and creating these initial detail views. That is going to be a key to your success in making these as clean and crisp as possible. Now I'm going to update my guard assembly view. That's something that I have to do in order to capture those changes. But my orientation now is not exactly the way I want it to be because I had to zoom in, I had to zoom out, I had to go through all this different information. This is where I can go down to my guard assembly camera view, simply double click on that camera view. Notice how my graphical area snapped back to the original orientation that we were working in. And I can then update my actual view. Again, it's a great way to stabilize the actual content that we are creating. So that's a little tip that I like to share, especially if you are looking eventually to export anything to an HTML or SVG file type. This does create vector graphics much higher quality than what the Digger tool can actually accomplish. So we took a look at some view tips and tricks. The second section that we're going to go into now that our views are completed is going to be creating interactive content. I'm going to walk you through how we can create this content, how we can create buttons, how we can create links, and really have some major strides toward that final publication that we saw at the beginning. Jumping back into SOLIDWORKS Composer, I'm going to go up into my initial view. One of the easiest ways that we can start creating buttons is to use some of the predefined buttons that the software already has set up for us. These can be found under the Authors tab, and then under 2D Image, we see that there are the next button, previous button, first button, last button, or all buttons. These are already predefined for you, and I'll explain why they're actually listed under 2D Images. I'm going to choose all buttons and place them inside of this view. If I left click on one item, that's going to highlight it so I can see the properties associated to that particular button. And if I scroll down, because these are predefined, you're going to notice that it's considered a widget, and we have all of this information in this bottom left-hand corner that has already been established for us. We can see that it already has a map path and that a link has already been established. So this is referring to the first view, the previous view, the next view, and then the last view. While these are great to know about, they do have their advantages. You can utilize them in many scenarios. One thing that they are going to do is they are going to only allow you to move linearly between your design. So you're going to go from one view to another. I want to have interactive content that is more dynamic. I want to be able to click on specific items and dig down deeper into my design. So while the built-in buttons are very powerful and they're good to know about, in this particular situation, maybe not the best way to approach it. So I'm going to simply delete them, and we're going to talk about creating some of these additional buttons. So this is our initial view. If we remember, all of our links and our interactive content is all essentially based off of this initial exploded view. We want everything to go back to this view. One of the easiest ways we can create buttons that are linked to existing views is, for example, to left click on a view, such as initial, hold down my control key, and then left click and drag it onto my existing view. If I highlight this so that it is orange and view its properties, we see that I now have full flexibility to change and edit this button however I want. I don't have anything grayed out like we saw with the predefined buttons. One item is the map path. Now, if I look at this, the tooltip is giving me essentially a local temporary location, and the actual item really is just a JPEG. So what Composer is doing is when it creates this button, it is capturing that thumbnail as a JPEG and creating that automatically for you. If I go down a little bit further, notice how I have a line item for link. This particular item under event for link is going to be critical to our success in creating this interactive content. We can also see it over towards the side that it is referencing view and then initial. So it's referencing this initial view. Over on the far right, there is a small button. It may be hard to see. It's just a button with 3 dots in it. If I left click on that, I actually have the opportunity that I can utilize and change what the URL is. So here we can see it set to view, and then that view is actually called initial. If I expand this, this is where I can choose what I want this button to be actually linked to. And we have quite a few options. We can choose to have this be linked to a separate file, to a web page, an FTP, a view, which is what we have utilized, and then the previous, first, next, and last. Those items are how the predefined buttons are actually set up. The bottom 3 are relating to animation. So yes, you can utilize buttons and interactive content inside of Composer animations as well. We are going to leave these with static views, but that is something that is important to know about, is it is not limited to static views. This can be utilized in animations also. At this point, I don't need to make any changes to this. I'm just going to show you how this is being linked, and I'm just going to click cancel because I don't need any more changes. One thing that inside of this initial exploded view, please make sure that when you make changes, you update the view. Remember, the update is the camera with the red symbol, the red little sphere next to it. Even though we're not necessarily making graphical changes, we still need to update all of this content. The next thing that we want to do is start creating links to some of these other views. Now, we want the end user to be able to click on any of these components and be able to access the right view. So instead of creating a button to the right view in the way we just did, I can actually select this entire right group so that it's highlighted. And then in the properties, I can choose to specify what this is going to be linked to. And again, I'm going to click on that button with the 3 little dots, and I'm going to choose this to be linked to a view. And then I can use the drop-down list of all my views. This is exactly why we want to rename our views to something more meaningful. If I have this huge list of view 1 through 100, not very meaningful. But because I've renamed them, I can simply choose the right side and click OK. Now, by linking that into all of these components, we are creating a situation where the end user doesn't have to click on something specific. They can simply click on any component on that right-hand side, and it will go to the proper view. That is important to know and to understand. We are going to do the same thing on some of these other sides as well. So this is going to be kind of a repetitive process. So I'm going to link this into the view and then the left side, click OK. This top portion, I'm going to link into an existing view that is called main body. And then this bottom portion, I'm going to link into an existing view that is called base. And then please don't forget to update your initial exploded view, even though graphical items have not changed. So we've created links inside of this one view that link it to other views. But we want this to be dynamic, and we need to have a method so that we always return to this initial exploded view. So let's address that in a couple other views that we have here. I'm going to add a button in my initial view. Even though initial exploded is the basis for this, we may run into a couple situations where we want to be able to view our entire design in a completely collapsed state. So that's what I'm compensating for with that particular view. Now, these remaining 6 views, we all need to create links and buttons between them so that we can create this dynamic interactive experience. So because our exploded view is the basis of everything, We know that these items are going to be linked to the right side. So let's tackle the right side next. I'm going to double click on my right side view from my view panel, and I'm going to again create a button that is going into that initial exploded view. Again, we always want a method to go back to that base view. Also here, we have a parts list that has everything called out except for items in this guard assembly on the far left. The reason why we're doing that is because that guard assembly has its own view. We want to create a link on that complete subassembly or all the components in that subassembly to go into a view called guard assembly. And then we can update our view. The same thing on the left side. We always want to make sure that we have a method back to our initial exploded view. And in this situation, be very careful about how you grab and select items. If you try to do a box select, you run the risk of potentially grabbing non-geometric actors or other auxiliary actors. In this case, I'm accidentally grabbing a line in the background. Now, for something like this, it may not have very many ramifications, but we want to be as precise as we can. We don't want to end up with something that's going to have behavior we're not expecting. So a simple way to make sure you're grabbing the correct information is to use your assembly tree. I can make use of my left-hand shield assembly. That is going to automatically highlight all of those components. As an alternative, you can also create your own selection sets. That's actually the process I used in order to organize this design from a composer perspective. Once these items have been highlighted and they are selected, we can choose to again link them into a specific view, and this is going to be our guard assembly. Make sure that we update our view. And now inside the actual guard assembly view that we've created, we want to add 3 views to this. This is an extra layer downward. So I'm going to start in creating some buttons. I'm going to choose a right button. I want to go back to the initial exploded view if I want to go just directly back to that initial view that we've established. And I'm also going to choose the left side, because remember, the right and the left, they are actually all linked together into a single view. So from here, we've created those 3 types of buttons, and we could be a little bit more precise about the placement. As a side note, these detail views that we created, they are just 2D images. If you click on one and look inside of the properties, you can absolutely create additional links and turn those items into buttons as well. In this particular example, I don't have anything currently set up to link it to, but that is definitely something that the software is capable of doing. It's turning those really crisp detail views into actual buttons and interactive content. We have just a couple more items that we're going to add into this. We are almost done creating these buttons. So we want to make sure we're always going back to that initial location. And I also want those middle components to be linked directly into the view called motor. And then going into the actual motor view, we want to make sure that we can link this back into the first upper level, which is the main body, and then always going back to that initial exploded view. And then last is our base. We don't have any additional levels, but we do want to make sure that we can go back into that initial exploded view. And then update. Almost forgot right there. Once we have this, we can actually use Composer to test what this looks like before we go through and publish it. The way that we do that is down in the bottom right-hand corner, there is an item called Design Mode. This is on by default, but we can turn it off. When we turn off the Design Mode, what that allows us to do is utilize what we've just created as if we were an end user. So I can click on the buttons. I can verify that they're taking me to the correct place. I can start clicking through different items, making sure that they are sending me to the right views, that I can dig down further, and that of course I always have a method to get back to my initial base view whenever I need to do that. And so this is a great way to test and double check your work before you go through and publish it and someone else uses it and decides that maybe there was an issue that we missed. So again, that is utilizing the design mode. So we took a look at creating some of this interactive content. Once we get the hang of it, once we have everything planned out, as you saw, it is a fairly simple yet repetitive process. We went through, we created buttons, we took a look at the predefined buttons, we created our own, and we created our own links. The last section that I want to talk about is actually publishing this content. We're going to take a look at a couple ways to do that. We're going to take our existing work as it is and see how we can utilize it. And then I'm also going to discuss how we can take what we've created and change it slightly, make some modifications to publish it for SVG files and vector graphics for the use on things such as web pages. Going into my Composer software, I'm not going to make any additional changes to this, but I am going to do a file save as, and I'm going to change this name so that we can open it and see what it looks like inside of the Composer player. So I'm going to go ahead and open this. And this is the same interface that we saw directly at the beginning. We can see how the users can go through all of this information. This is just saving it directly as a native SOLIDWORKS Composer file type, which is a .smg. And we can start moving through this design dynamically. We don't have to go through it linearly one step at a time to get where we want to go. We can go back and forth between all of these different views and different phases of the design. What's really nice about using the SOLIDWORKS Composer player is that it is completely free. It is something that no one needs a license for to download Composer player. And you do have the ability to pan, zoom, and rotate everything in a 3D environment so that you can see exactly what you're looking at, see all of the little details as well. So again, we can always zoom in on this information should we need it. This is utilizing the Composer player. Again, it's one of the easiest, fastest, simplest ways to export and publish interactive content for other people to use. With that, we didn't have to make any changes to it. Now, when we talk about exporting as a .svg file type, there's a couple extra things that we do actually want to do. And one of the first things that we're going to do is save out these dummy files. This is just my Windows Explorer. What I've done is before I started today's webinar, I did save out all of these specific views as basically a dummy SVG file type. I will show you how to do that. At this point, we know that all of these items, they are linking to individual views. However, when we start dealing with vector graphics, all of these views in our view panel, they are going to be saved as their own file types, and we want all of the different file types to be related. So there's some additional work that we have to do. But first of all, as I want to just save all the views out that I have, just so that I have the file in order to create the links to. So at this moment in time, it doesn't even matter if our dummy SVG files are completely incorrect, as long as They are named correctly. All we need them for is to create the links, and we will export on top of them as our final publishing. So under my workshops, I'm going to choose my technical illustration. And just because we want to save dummy files, I am going to just greatly simplify all of this information. I'm going to turn off lines and colors, and then under multiple, I can choose my checkbox for views. This is going to export this out as a file name underscore view name. This is how we can export every single view in this Composer project as an SVG file in one operation. Now, the actual technical illustration workshop has its own Save As button. That's what's being highlighted here. Please use that particular Save As button. It is different than the File Save As button that you would get under the File tab. So please use the Save As under your technical illustration. And from here, this is what we would go through. We would just choose our location and hit save, and then Composer would go through and link everything and save everything as an SVG file wherever we decide to place it. Since I already have all my dummy files set up and saved, I'm just going to hit cancel, but that is the process we would go through. What we would want to do next is, instead of linking everything to individual views, we would want to link them to those SVG files. We want to establish the links between the files themselves. So for example, if I left click on this particular button, this is going back into my initial file. Instead of going and having my views linked together, I would want this to choose to be a specific file. And I would link this into bench webinar underscore initial and then click OK. The same thing would apply to all of these other links that we had created. If we decided we wanted them to go to a specific file for SVG output, we would have to go through each and every one of these and make sure that they are referencing the correct file. It's the exact same process that we went through before. So again, there's nothing too different on this process than what we saw before, other than the little trick to it is knowing that you absolutely have to have some type of file already saved. Now, I already have a project that I've gone through and I have changed all of those links so you don't have to watch me do it, because I know that you guys at this point understand how those links work. But all of these items have been updated so that they are referencing the correct files. Now, the last piece of information as far as publishing all of this out is, again, I'm going to go under my technical illustration workshop. Under lines, I can choose how I want my lines or my colored regions to export. I'm going to deselect the light checkbox just for this example. It makes the output a little bit faster just for brevity. And I'm going to choose my multiple tab a second time. Make sure I choose views. And I want to make sure that my naming convention is going to be correct. Because I've already established the links to these existing files, the goal is to simply overwrite those files with the same name so that the content is just now updated. So again, under my technical illustration workshop, I'm going to choose Save As. I'm going to just choose my first item, bench grinder, and all of my other views are going to go through and be saved and override these items. So we'll even see, are you sure you want to replace it? Yes, I do. So SOLIDWORKS Composer is going to go through every view inside of my views panel and do a file save as operation to convert them into SVG file types. This does take a little bit of time, so just kind of sit back, have a little bit of a breather there. It doesn't take too long, but just so that you know, if you have a really large project with 100+ views, this will take a good couple of minutes to export out. Now, because I'm working with certain settings to really speed this up, my actual export did go by pretty quickly. We're going to see an example of what the actual end result looks like. So inside of my files that have now been completely overwritten, I'm going to go ahead and just right click on my initial exploded view, and I'm going to open this inside of Google Chrome. And this gives us an example of what this SVG output is going to look like. We can see that yes, it is indeed linking to an SVG file type. However, we can still utilize all the buttons. We can go back and forth through our design, and I can still click on all of our specific views. Now, because this is actual technical illustration, we do not have the ability to pan, zoom, and rotate. This is not a 3D environment. However, we do have the dynamic highlighting associated with our parts list, and it does go both ways depending on what I'm hovering over. So that can definitely add a lot of clarity into this type of published SVG file. Again, I can go down deeper into this design and be able to dynamically move through it as I need to and as I see fit. So we were able to create all those links, publish everything out, and create some very nice interactive content for our field services team or internal teams, depending on who's going to be utilizing this information. So we took a look at some publishing, mainly through SVG output and the SOLIDWORKS Composer player. We took a look throughout this entire webinar at some view tips and tricks inside of Composer, including using the technical illustrator for those detail views to create those nice vector graphics that we saw in the SVG output. We went over several ways to actually create interactive content utilizing the buttons, the predefined buttons as well, and then multiple ways that we can create links to different types of information. And then we saw some simple ways that we can publish all of this information to create some interactive content for our end users.